Hello everyone, my name is Bill Robbins and I'm going to be discussing primary and secondary sources, the differences between them, and how the nature of the research being conducted can determine whether a source is primary or secondary. And I'm going to be focusing on artifacts and physical objects as primary sources. Now, primary sources are those sources that were created contemporary with the historical event or the person being investigated. They can include documents such as government documents, manuscripts, news articles, letters and diaries, even literature or music from the time period. Primary sources can also take the form of photographs, videos, and physical objects and artifacts. And these create a great deal of confusion when being used as sources. Secondary sources are those that investigate a historical event or actor after a passage of time and rely on primary sources to conduct their investigation. And these can be journal articles, books, news articles, things of that nature. Again, physical objects and artifacts can be secondary sources as well as primary sources, and the topic being investigated can affect, again, the nature of the source. This image illustrates the variety of primary source documents one may encounter. This is the canceled Treasury warrant or check in the amount of $7.2 million drawn on the U.S. Treasury that was used to purchase Alaska from Russia in 1868. This would be a primary source for a discussion of the history of Alaska, the U.S. Treasury Department, American expansion, or perhaps biographical research regarding Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the deal on behalf of the U.S., or perhaps President Andrew Johnson. This image shows the first and final pages of the original manuscript of George Washington's farewell address, 1796. This is an important historical document and valuable to research regarding George Washington, early American politics, the history of political parties in America, and a host of other topics. This image shows an example of a secondary source. It is a journal article by Jeffrey L. Mallinson, published in the Journal of the Early Republic, that discusses Washington's farewell address. Specifically, after Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr, a draft of Washington's farewell address was found in Hamilton's papers, written in Hamilton's hand. And this created a 5-decade debate over authorship of the address. Mallinson uses primary sources, including copies of the farewell address from Washington's and Hamilton's papers, in his discussion. Photographs can provide valuable primary source evidence. These images show my great-great-grandfather, who served in the Scots 900, also known as the 11th New York Cavalry. After the war, he became an officer in the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a Civil War Veterans Association. The first image is a painting of a photograph taken in about 1863. The painting was also completed during the Civil War. So this is a visual arts representation of what a journal article is, but it still provides primary source evidence regarding his appearance, the uniform that was worn. You can tell from the saber that he is wearing that he is a cavalry trooper. The second image was taken about 1910, and in addition to physical appearance and membership in the GAR, it preserves evidence of my great-great-grandfather's home. Both images provide primary source evidence regarding this person, or perhaps Civil War or GAR uniforms. However, both may be secondary evidence for other more general topics, such as the Civil War in general. Historians should locate and review primary sources wherever possible. In many cases, the primary sources have been destroyed and they only exist in secondary sources. But to give you an example, I was conducting research for a project, and I came across a journal article that included a great quote that really supported my argument. The journal article author cited a dissertation that he found the quote in. So I located the dissertation and then located the primary source that the quote came from, and it happened to be a source that I actually had in my possession. So I began to investigate the primary source, and the quote did not exist in the primary source. So whatever happened, perhaps the dissertation author accidentally cited the wrong source for the quote, and perhaps the author of the journal article was aware that the quote was not in the source, and that's why he just relied on citing the journal article. But it illustrates why you need to review the primary source. Go to the primary source to verify your information. The greatest source of confusion, I believe, regarding the difference between primary and secondary sources is in the use of physical objects and artifacts. These can be primary or secondary sources depending on the topic being investigated and, of course, the source itself. These types of sources can include personal belongings such as clothing, footwear, eyeglasses. They can include tools, furniture, weapons, even buildings and landscapes. These images show a Civil War era Model 1840 non-commissioned officer sword and a Model 1861 Springfield rifle musket bayonet from a Massachusetts regiment. Though both were used during the Civil War, these artifacts can only provide evidence of the type of weapons in service during the war. The sword was issued from 1840 to 1875, and the bayonet from 1861 to 1873, and both were used long after by state regiments and militia. Other than the Massachusetts designation on the bayonet scabbard, neither bears date, manufacturer, or other information, nor were they found in a historical context such as a battlefield. Without any additional information, these weapons can not be associated with a specific event or individual during the Civil War, or even the Civil War period. In any case, both can be used as primary sources in research regarding edged weapons, U.S. military swords, firearms, or bayonets, and many other topics specific to these weapons. But in more general topics such as the Civil War, these would be secondary sources. Regarding the sword, I happen to have personal knowledge that it belonged to my great-great-grandfather, and he is wearing it in the 1910 GAR photo. But without this knowledge, the sword would be almost useless as a primary source unless the investigation specifically related to the sword or type of sword. This is the U.S. War Department issued gravestone of Civil War soldier James C. Anderson, who served in Company D of the 19th Virginia Infantry. But this is a secondary source only for evidence of Anderson's life or an investigation of the 19th Virginia. In fact, the stone was not placed on Anderson's grave until 1940. This document shows that Anderson died in May 1876, and Anderson's daughter, Mrs. Robert A. Farley, ordered the headstone from the War Department in January 1940, and the stone was shipped in August and delivered to nearby Esmond Depot on the Nelson and Albemarle Railway. The headstone would be primary source evidence for research regarding War Department issued headstones or recognition of Confederate soldiers as veterans of U.S. wars, not, however, as U.S. veterans. And the application for the headstone provides primary source for biographical and genealogical research for James Anderson, his daughter, or his family. These images illustrate the need to locate supporting and corroborating sources. Benjamin D. Anderson was James Anderson's brother, and he also served in the 19th Virginia. He was wounded at the Battle of South Mountain in September 1862 and died at the U.S. military hospital in Frederick, Maryland a month later. He was buried at the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Frederick. The first picture shows Benjamin's weathered original headstone with the inscription B.D. Anderson, 19th Virginia Regiment, died October 20, 1862. The later War Department headstone bears the name Benjamin J. Anderson, with the first name misspelled and the middle initial incorrect, and shows his rank as second lieutenant. Records show Benjamin Anderson never advanced above private. Both stones show that Benjamin died 20 October. Multiple records indicate he died 19 October. Again, these stones represent primary source evidence for a discussion of War Department headstones, recognition of Confederate veterans, or efforts to locate, inter, and memorialize Civil War dead. They do not provide primary source evidence for research regarding Anderson's life or the 19th Virginia Infantry, for example. And in fact, the evidence on the stones, on the later stone, is incorrect. Primary sources are valuable to the historian when conducting research. Whether a source is primary or secondary is not only determined by the nature of the source, but the topic being investigated can determine whether a source is primary or secondary. And a lot of confusion hovers around the use of physical objects and artifacts as primary and secondary sources. So you have to keep in mind the topic you're researching, what kind of research you're doing, when you're using physical objects and artifacts, and determine whether it's physical or secondary using that information. Thank you very much.